The morning sun barely crept over the horizon when she first saw him. The mist still hung over the river like a thin veil, softening the harshness of the wilderness. The air smelled of damp soil and pine needles, and the only sounds were the lazy current of the creek and the calls of distant birds. She had come to the riverbank to wash clothes, her hands raw from the cold water, her mind heavy with thoughts of the past few months of loneliness, of survival, of the weight that came with being alone on the edge of a land that seemed to test every soul that dared to tame it. But what she found that morning would change her life forever. At first, she thought it was just another trick of the shifting light. A patch of movement near the bend in the river caught her eye deer. Perhaps or maybe just the shadow of a branch swaying in the breeze. But then came the sound that froze her blood, a strangled cry, sharp and desperate. Her head jerked up and she saw him, a young boy, his small body sinking fast into the pale, wet earth at the edge of the river. The more he struggled, the deeper he went. The ground around him rippled like breathing mud, swallowing his legs, then his hips, as panic twisted his face. She dropped the basket, her heart hammering. The boy's cries carried across the water, raw and pleading. She didn't stop to think. Her boots sank into the mud as she rushed forward, the hem of her skirt dragging through the cold muck. "Hold on," she shouted, her voice trembling. The boy reached out to her, his arms flailing, but the riverbank gave way beneath him. The mud pulled like claws, sucking him down with each frantic movement. She glanced around for anything. Nan spotted a half-rotted branch lying near the shore. Grabbing it, she slid closer to the edge, her breath coming in gasps. "Take it!" she yelled, thrusting the branch toward him. There, eyes met for a heartbeat, his dark, wide and wild with fear. He was no settler's child. His hair was long and black, his face painted with faint streaks of earth and ash. Feathers hung from a small leather cord tied around his neck, marking him as someone from the tribes who lived beyond the ridge, the Comanche. For a split second, she hesitated. The stories told around campfires about raids, lost cattle, and burned homesteads came flooding back. Yet none of that mattered as she watched him sink another inch. "Grab it now," she shouted again, straining forward. The boy seized the branch with both hands, his fingers slick with mud. She braced her feet, gritting her teeth, and pulled with all her strength. The branch bent dangerously but held. Slowly, painfully, she drew him closer, the sound of the river and his desperate breathing filling her ears. Each tug sent shocks of pain through her arms, but she didn't stop until he was close enough for her to reach out and grab his wrists. With one final heave, she pulled him free, and they both tumbled onto the bank. Gasping for air, for a long moment neither of them spoke. The boy coughed up mud, trembling. She knelt beside him, wiping the sludge from his face with the edge of her sleeve. His eyes darted around, still full of fear, but when he looked at her again, there was something else, something that flickered between gratitude and confusion. She smiled faintly, though her hands still shook. "You're safe now," she said softly. He didn't answer, but his gaze lingered. His clothes were torn, his small chest heaving with exhaustion. She noticed the necklace, again a piece of carved bone and feathers, something precious. Carefully, she helped him sit up. "Your people are they nearby?" she asked, gesturing toward the open plains beyond the trees. The boy shook his head, his expression tightening. He spoke a few words in his language, too fast for her to understand, but she caught the fear in his tone. Whoever he was, he had been running. She wanted to ask more, but the sound of hoofbeats in the distance made her turn sharply. Her heart skipped. The prairie stretched wide and silent, yet somewhere beyond the ridge, horses moved. For a moment she wondered if it was settlers from the nearest fort or something else. The boy stiffened, clutching the necklace at his chest. Then, as quickly as he could, he got to his feet. His legs wobbled, and she caught his arm to steady him. "You can't go," she said. "You need to rest." But he shook his head again and took a step back. The sun was rising now, throwing long shadows across the muddy ground. His small figure, covered in dirt, looked almost ghost-like against the golden light. He pointed toward the hills, said something short and firm, and then ran. She called out, but he didn't stop. Within moments, he vanished into the brush, leaving her standing by the river, her clothes soaked, her hands trembling around the broken branch. That night, she couldn't sleep. The wind outside her small cabin carried the sound of coyotes, and the unease in her chest only grew. Who was that boy? What had he been running from? She tried to push the thoughts away, telling herself she had done her part. She had saved a life, but deep down she knew it wasn't over. The way he had looked at her before running off, the fear, urgency, meant something she couldn't yet understand. By the second day, strange things began to happen, she found. Tracks near her fence line, hoofprints, more than one set, leading toward the woods. A broken twig, a shift of shadow at the edge of her vision. The forest, usually calm, felt like it was watching her. She tried to convince herself it was just nerves, but her gut told her otherwise. Someone had been there, and whoever they were, they hadn't come to steal or harm, at least, not yet. That evening, she sat by the fire, staring at the small carved feather she had found near the riverbank. The boy must have dropped it when he ran. She turned it in her hand, the light of the fire dancing across its edges. It felt like more than a trinket, felt like a message. Outside, the wind grew stronger, rattling the shutters. She rose to bolt the door, but before she could reach it, she heard the distant rhythm of drums. Faint at first, then growing stronger. The sound rolled across the prairie, carried by the night air. Her pulse quickened. She stepped onto the porch, clutching the feather in her palm. The moon hung low over the fields, silvering the tall grass. Then she saw them. Dark shapes moved along the horizon, riders, dozens of them, their horses galloping in perfect rhythm. Torches flickered like fireflies in the darkness. She stood frozen, her breath catching in her throat. The ground seemed to tremble beneath their approach, and then, through the torchlight, she saw him again, the same boy she had pulled from the quicksand, riding at the front beside a tall warrior draped in eagle feathers and beads that glimmered in the firelight. The boy lifted his arm and pointed toward her cabin. The riders slowed, their silhouettes cutting against the moonlit sky. Her heart pounded as she realized what was happening. The child she had saved hadn't just returned, he had brought his entire tribe. The firelight glinted off the chief's eyes as he dismounted, stepping forward through the dust and torchlight. The air between them felt charged, suspended in that fragile moment between fear and fate. She gripped the feather tighter, unsure whether to run, to speak, or to stand her ground. And as the wind swept across the plain, carrying the distant cry of wolves, she understood her act of kindness had set something in motion that neither side could have expected. The night air was thick with the scent of smoke and earth as the riders drew closer. She stood frozen by the doorway, her breath shallow, the wooden boards creaking beneath her feet. The torchlight painted their faces in flickering orange, and for the first time she saw them clearly, the Comanche warriors. Proud and silent, their eyes sharp as the blades at their sides. Their horses snorted and pawed at the ground, restless under the strain of tension that hung between them and the lone cabin by the river. The boy she had saved dismounted first. His small frame moved quickly toward her, his feet light on the dirt, his necklace glinting against the firelight. Behind him came a man taller than any she had ever seen, broad-shouldered and calm, his expression unreadable. His presence alone commanded silence among the riders. She didn't need to be told this was the chief, the boy's father. Stories she had heard from the settlers in town came rushing back, tales of chiefs who avenged their kin, of tribes that struck without warning when wronged. Her heart pounded, but she didn't move. The boy stopped just a few steps away from her porch, his dark eyes locked on hers. He said something in his own language, soft but firm, and though she didn't understand, the tone was clear. He wasn't afraid. He was telling her not to be either. The chief stepped forward, his shadow stretching long in the firelight. He said a few words to his men, and they lowered their weapons slightly, but stayed mounted. The boy pointed toward her, then toward the river, speaking fast, his hands moving as he tried to explain. She could only stand there, gripping the feather she had found. The chief's gaze followed her movements, his expression changing slightly when he saw what she held. He raised his hand, palm open, not as a threat, but as acknowledgement. She swallowed hard. "I didn't mean any harm," she said quietly, though she knew they couldn't understand her words. "He was sinking," just her voice caught. The chief tilted his head slightly, then spoke to the boy again. The child translated in broken English, his words halting. "You help me, River. Eat me, you pull me out." He looked back at his father and added a few words in Comanche. The chief nodded slowly, then looked at her again, his eyes softer now, though still wary. For a long while, no one moved. Then the chief spoke once more, and his men began to dismount, setting their torches into the ground. They weren't here for revenge. Still, she felt her pulse thudding in her throat. The chief pointed toward her cabin, then to the sky, as if asking for shelter. She hesitated, unsure what to do. Letting a group of armed warriors near her home was dangerous, but turning them away felt worse. So she stepped aside, motioning for them to approach. The boy smiled faintly, the first sign of warmth since that morning by the river. They didn't enter, not yet. Instead, the chief sat near the fire outside, his men forming a quiet circle around him. She watched from the doorway as they spoke in low tones, the rhythm of their words almost like the hum of the river itself. She couldn't understand, but she could feel the weight of their discussion. Every once in a while, the boy looked back at her as if to make sure she was still there. When the fire burned low, the chief stood and walked toward her. He stopped a few steps away and placed his hand over his chest, then gestured toward the boy. "My son," he said slowly, his accent heavy. "You save him." She nodded, unsure what to say. The chief's gaze held hers for a long time, and in that silence, something unspoken passed between them. Respect, maybe even trust. He looked up toward the stars, murmured a few words in his tongue, and then turned away. The warriors mounted again, the boy glancing back once more before they disappeared into the dark plains. The sound of their horses faded slowly into the night, leaving her alone once more, the fire crackling beside her and the feathers still clenched in her hand. For the next few days, she couldn't shake the feeling that eyes watched her from the woods. When she went to fetch water from the river, she saw hoofprints again, but always fresh, never leading too close. At night, she sometimes heard faint drumming in the distance, or the call of an owl that sounded almost human. The silence that followed each sound was heavier than before. She didn't know if the tribe meant to protect her or warn her. But either way, she knew she was not forgotten. Life on the frontier had always been lonely, but now it felt different. The land itself seemed alive with secrets. Each gust of wind carried whispers from the plains. Each rustle in the trees felt like a signal. And in those quiet moments, she found herself wondering about that boy, how close he had come to dying, how his small hand had clung to that branch like it was the last thing in the world. She thought about his father, too. The way he had stood so still, neither friend nor enemy. A man caught between two worlds, just as she was. The townsfolk in the nearest settlement would never believe her story. They spoke of the Comanche with fear, not understanding. Yet she couldn't bring herself to think of them that way anymore. There had been something human in their eyes that night, something proud, but not cruel. Still, the danger was real. Settlers and tribes lived with mistrust hanging over them like thunderclouds. One wrong move, one misunderstanding, and the whole prairie could burn. One afternoon, while repairing the fence behind her cabin, she found another sign and arrow lodged in the post, its shaft painted red and black. Her first instinct was fear, but when she pulled it free, she noticed something tied just below the feathers, a small strip of cloth, patterned with the same symbols she had seen on the chief's armband. It wasn't a threat. It was a message, maybe even a token of peace. That night, she lit a lantern and set it by the window. The wind blew softly through the trees, carrying the faint smell of sage and smoke. She thought about leaving it there, a quiet way of saying she understood. But the uncertainty still clawed at her heart. What if others saw it? What if word spread that she had contact with the Comanche? The settlers had their own kind of fear that made them dangerous. Sleep didn't come easily. The memory of that boy's face haunted her dreams, his eyes wide with terror as the quicksand dragged him down. Then the relief when she pulled him free. And then, There was the look on the chief's face, measured, searching, as if he was trying to decide whether she was a blessing or a threat. She couldn't forget it. By the third day, the silence around her homestead began to break. She found fresh game near her door, neatly wrapped in hide. No tracks led away. Someone had left it as a gift. She hesitated before bringing it inside, unsure whether to accept it. But hunger spoke louder than pride. When she cooked it that evening, she whispered a quiet thanks into the air, unsure if anyone was listening. Later, she sat by the river again, staring at the spot where the mud had nearly swallowed the boy. The water flowed quietly now, but the ground still bore the scars of that struggle. The earth remembered. She knelt beside it, trailing her fingers through the cool water, and whispered, "You're safe now, wherever you are." The sun was setting when she saw the first shadow move on the opposite bank. Her heart skipped, but this time she didn't reach for the rifle. The figure was familiar. The boy again, standing half-hidden among the reeds. He raised a hand in greeting. Behind him, more shapes appeared, warriors, women, even children. The same tribe that had ridden under the moonlight was back, but this time they weren't armed for war. The boy stepped forward, pointing toward the sky and then to her. His father followed slowly behind, carrying something wrapped in hide. They crossed the shallow part of the river and stopped a few feet away. The chief unwrapped the bundle. It was filled with gifts, beads, dried herbs, a carved figure of an eagle. He placed it on the ground before her and spoke softly, his tone respectful. The boy translated, though not perfectly. "My father say, your heart is strong. You save blood of our people. We not forget." Her throat tightened. The wind rustled the grass, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled. The chief looked toward the horizon, then back at her. He pointed to the woods, his expression grave, and spoke again. The boy hesitated before translating. "Bad men come soon. White men guns. You go away." "Far from here?" Her stomach turned cold. "What men?" she asked, but the boy only shook his head. The chief mounted his horse again, his face stern. He said a final word, something that sounded like warning, and then they turned and rode off into the gathering dusk. The boy lingered a moment longer, his eyes filled with worry. Before following the rest, she stood there long after they had vanished. The gifts still at her feet, the air trembling with the echo of hooves. The land was quiet again, but it no longer felt safe. She could feel the storm coming, not from the sky, but from men and fear and the space between two worlds that could no longer stay apart. The kindness that had once saved a child might now bring danger to her door. The warning settled into her bones like a cold wind. She carried the bundle of gifts inside and set it gently on the table. But her eyes kept going to the door, as if danger might step through it at any moment. The words were simple, yet they scraped against everything she had tried to believe since coming to this frontier homestead. Bad men come soon. White men. Guns. It was not the first time someone had whispered trouble across the prairie, but this felt different. It was not gossip from town or a rumor told by a passing rider. It was a message from a father who had stood under the moon with his entire Comanche. Triben looked her in the eye. The next day, she walked the fence line, as if every post could tell her a secret about what was coming. The sky was high and cold, the kind of blue that made the river look deeper than it was. She fixed a loose hinge on the back gate, stacked wood near the porch, and tried to keep her hands busy, but her mind wandered. She thought about the time before the frontier, before the cabin and the river crossing, before she knew the smell of sage after a rain. Back then, problems had been small and personal. Out here, they stretched across the prairie and involved people who measured time by seasons and riders, who could vanish into tall grass and return with a thunder of hooves. Near afternoon, a wagon appeared on the stage road, the wheels rattling hard on the dry ruts. A pair of mules pulled it, followed by two men on horseback. She recognized the wagon from the settlement. The driver was the trader who ran the general store, a lean man with sharp eyes. Beside him rode the new deputy from the fort. He was young and stubborn, the kind who had learned law from a book and believed the world would shape itself to his rules. They stopped at her fence and hailed her. She set the hammer down and walked to meet them at the gate. The deputy studied her with a careful look. He wore a star that seemed too shiny for this weathered land. The trader nodded respectfully, but he kept his hands close to his coat, as if measuring the weight of what might be hidden inside. The deputy spoke first. He said they were checking on folks along the river because there had been reports of cattle missing and a survey team chased from the ridge. He said the fort was concerned about rising tension. He asked if she had seen any riders at night. She felt the words press against her tongue. She thought of the boy's small hand around the branch, the chief's steady eyes, the gifts on her table. Every story had a cost, and she could not measure the price yet. So she said she had seen tracks, which was true, and heard drumming far off, which was also true. She added that the river had swallowed a child recently, which was not the story they wanted but was still the thing that mattered to her. The trader's gaze flicked to the waterline and back. The deputy leaned forward in his saddle. He said the fort planned a patrol south of the ridge. If trouble came from the river crossing, they wanted to be ready. He asked if she would signal by hanging a lantern from the cottonwood if she saw riders again. She met his stare and nodded because refusing would cause more questions. When they left, her knees felt weak. They took the road west, talking in low voices. She watched until the wagon topped the rise and vanished into the light like a mirage. That evening she ground corn by the hearth and thought about the thin ice of peace. The Comanche tribe had left game at her door. The fort wanted her lantern as a signal. She stood between two fires, and neither side could afford to trust her fully. She understood the deputy's fear. She understood the chief's warning. Understanding did not help her sleep. After dark, the owl called again from the grove. It was not the usual rhythm. She stepped onto the porch with the lantern raised to shoulder height. The wind lifted her hair and brought the dry scent of earth. A shape moved near the woodpile. She set the lantern down slowly and waited. The boy stepped into the light. He looked thinner than before. A little ghost of a rider with mud on his leggings and a scrape along one cheek. He pressed his palm to his chest in greeting, then pointed to the hills. His words were quick and soft, and she had to lean in to understand. Men from town had crossed the ridge that afternoon. They hunted a band of Comanche youths who had been scouting. No one was hurt, but there had been shouting and the kind of staring that could turn a mistake into a fight. The boy said his father wanted her to know that the patrol would pass near her land. He said she should leave before dawn and travel east along the river until the cottonwoods thickened. She crouched to meet his eyes. "What about you?" He shook his head. He would circle back to his people. Then he reached into his pouch and pulled out a leather cord with a small stone tied to it. He placed it in her hand. He said it belonged to his sister and that it meant safe travel. She felt the small weight of it and the larger weight of the trust it represented. He stepped back, then hesitated as if debating something more. Finally, he pointed to the far bank where the quicksand lay, where the river bend held its soft trap. He traced a path in the dirt with a stick, showing where the ground was firm and where it was not. He was teaching her how to survive the crossing. She realized it was not just kindness, it was a plan. She spent the night packing quietly. She rolled a blanket, set aside dried beans and a tinderbox, and tucked the leather cord into the inner pocket of her coat. She left the gifts from the chief where they were on the table, as if the room itself could watch over them. She doused the lantern and waited through the last hours of darkness, listening for hooves or the scrape of boots. Dawn came pale and cautious. The river mist rose like breath from a sleeping animal. She chose not to leave. Instead, she saddled the old bay and led him behind the cabin, where a shallow hollow hid him from the road. She could not run every time a different wind blew across the plains. If men came, she would face them. If the tribe sent another message, she would listen. She hid the rifle under a quilt inside and kept only a small pistol at her hip, more for comfort than for use. Then she walked the path the boy had traced in the dirt and studied the riverbank until she felt she could walk it in her sleep. The quicksand gleamed dull and lazy under the morning light. By mid-afternoon, the sky changed. A thin gray line gathered on the horizon and spread like ink in water. The cottonwoods swayed and the river darkened. She was inside cutting strips of cloth when hoofbeats broke the wind. She stepped to the window and saw 5 riders in a wagon angling down toward the crossing. The deputy led them. The trader drove again. 3 others rode behind, rough men who handled their rifles with an easy care that said they had done this before. They did not look like men out for a friendly talk. She walked out to meet them at the fence, keeping her hands visible. The deputy greeted her by name and said they had lost a small herd at sunrise. He asked whether she had heard anything. She told him the truth. She had heard only wind and river. The trader studied her porch, his eyes falling for a second on the faint mark where the chief had stood. One of the riders asked if she had seen a boy near the water. She held his gaze and said she had not seen any child since the morning she pulled one out of the mud. The deputy's jaw tightened. He said they planned to check the far bank for tracks. She warned them about the quicksand. He nodded without interest. They started toward the river. She followed. At the bend, the deputy signaled, and 2 riders pushed ahead. She called out that the ground swallowed what it could not hold. The men laughed, light and careless, and the first horse sank a knee into the soft muck. The animal lurched and backpedaled, throwing clods. The rider swore and yanked the reins. The deputy snapped that they would circle. They tried upstream and found firmer footing. She breathed again, though her hands were cold. On the far side, the deputy dismounted and scanned the shoreline. He found a broken reed and a faint scuff that could have been anything. He said it was proof. The trader crouched and touched the ground like a man reading a ledger. He pointed to the hills and said the tribe had passed that way. One of the riders suggested they make a show, light a torch and send a message. The deputy did not agree, but he did not say no. He kept turning slowly, as if he could force the land to confess. They searched for an hour. The only marks were deer prints and the memory of hooves long gone. Finally, the deputy approached her with a measured look. He asked if she would be willing to stay at the settlement until things settled. She felt the weight of the request. Moving into town would tell the tribe she had chosen a side. Staying put would tell the fort she had chosen another. She said she would think on it. The deputy studied her face and seemed ready to push, then he reined back. They rode off, promising to return. When the silence fell again, it felt sharper. She walked the far bank and found nothing but a single feather caught in a reed, brown with a pale tip. She tied it to the leather cord and kept it around her neck. The storm reached the ridge and paused there as if deciding whether to honor this valley with rain. Late light slanted over the prairie and turned the grass the color of old brass. As twilight settled, a woman she had seen only once before came along the river path from the east. She was a rancher's wife from 3 miles away, a quiet soul who traded eggs for coffee each month. She carried a bundle under her shawl and moved like someone who did not want to be seen. When she reached the porch, the woman's face was pale. She said the men who rode with the deputy had visited her place at noon, asking questions she did not like. They wanted to know who had dealings with the tribe and who might be friendly. They asked about the quicksand rescue and whether the child had returned. The woman said she had heard their talk when they left. The trader had told them that fear could move a town faster than a stagecoach. He said a good scare would bring more business to his store and more power to the fort. The rancher's wife lifted the bundle. Inside lay a tin of coffee and a small Bible she had once lent and forgotten. She said she could not keep either gift if it tied them together in public. Not now. She looked ashamed and asked for understanding. The storyteller in the cabin nodded and took the tin without blame. Survival made strange rules. The neighbor pressed her hand and warned that a meeting had been called at the settlement for the next night. Men would speak about the Comanche camp rumored beyond the ridge. Some would want a patrol. Others would call for a treaty. The loudest would want both in the same breath. When the woman left, the sky finally opened. Rain fell steady and clean. The smell of wet dust washed through the room. For a while, the sound of it made everything simple. She watched it run in dark streams over the path the riders had made. The river swelled, and the quicksand sighed, as if it too understood how close men had come to its hunger. Near midnight, another signal came. Not an owl. not drums. It was a small glow rising and falling at the edge of the grove like a star trying to breathe. She stepped into the rain and followed it to the cottonwoods. The boy waited under a low branch, a strip of bark held like a lantern. He beckoned her deeper where the leaves made a roof. There his sister stood with a horse and a bundle of herbs. She was near her own age, but carried herself with the quiet power of someone who knew the old paths. She spoke a few words in English. They had learned of the meeting in town. The chief wanted her to understand that the tribe would not move from their camp, because moving would look like guilt. They would hold to the hills and wait. He asked if the lantern signal from her cottonwood meant the patrol had threatened her. She said no. She said she had warned them about the crossing and watched them anyway. The sister nodded like one judging a bridge before stepping onto it. The boy looked troubled. He took a stick and drew 2 circles in the wet dirt. One was her cabin. One was the tribe's camp. Then he dragged a line between them and cut it with a cross. He pointed toward the settlement and made a shape like a mouth speaking. Men would choose where to cut. She felt the truth of it in her chest. She asked about the missing cattle and the survey team. The sister shrugged, neither guilty nor defensive. She said the herd had wandered downriver 3 nights ago when lightning scared them. She said youths had shadowed the surveyors to keep an eye on strangers who made too many marks on the ground. No arrows were drawn. No threats were made. But fear did not need arrows to fly. They left her with herbs to calm the heart and a twist of dried berries for strength. Before they slipped back into the dark, the sister touched the leather cord at her neck and nodded. The boy held up 3 fingers, then pointed at the moon and lowered 1 finger for each night to come. In 3 nights, something would happen. He did not say what. He did not need to. She lay awake until dawn, listening to the last threads of rain and the small sounds a cabin makes when it tries to be brave. When the sun finally rose, fog clung to the river. She brewed coffee and watched it steam while her thoughts drifted through all the possible roads ahead. She could attend the meeting and speak, but a single voice could be turned against itself. She could hang the lantern and invite the patrol, but that would set a match to dry grass. She could ride to the camp and warn them again. Someone watched these trails. By afternoon, the clouds cleared and the wind shifted. From the west came the faint thud of hooves and the murmur of men. From the east, a darker line moved across the hills, where the tribe's riders sometimes trained their horses. The stage road cut between both, a ribbon that held no loyalty. She stood on the porch with the leather cord warm against her skin and knew. The middle ground was shrinking as evening bled into the river. 2 distant fires bloomed at once, one near the ridge and one near the settlement road. Each fire sent a message into the dark. She could not read either, but she understood the shape of the moment. Somewhere a choice was waiting to be made, and every path carried a price she could not yet name. She stepped down from the porch and started toward the cottonwood where the river bend began. Not sure who would appear first at the crossing, the evening turned heavy with silence. As the 2 fires on opposite horizons burned brighter, one near the ridge and the other near the road. She stood between them, the faint wind pushing her hair across her face, the river whispering behind her. The world seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the first sound that would break the uneasy stillness. Each glow represented a promise and a threat. She knew one belonged to the Comanche camp, the other to the settlement men who planned to march at dawn. Between those fires lay her small cabin. Caught in the middle like a bridge no one trusted but everyone needed through the night, she moved about quietly, preparing for what might come. She gathered food, packed a small satchel, and checked the pistol hidden in the drawer. She hated the weight of it in her hand. The leather cord with the feather and stone rested against her chest, a reminder that she wasn't entirely alone. She thought of the boy and his sister, of the chief's calm eyes, of how fragile peace had become on this wild frontier. Even the land itself seemed to lean toward, conflict trees bending one way, wind pushing the other, the river splitting them down the middle. Before dawn, thunder rumbled far off over the plains. She stepped outside and saw faint movements near the ridge, the glimmer of steel, the flick of torchlight. The patrol from the settlement had started early. She knew the tribe was somewhere in the low valley beyond, perhaps already watching, perhaps already preparing for what they believed would be an attack. Her pulse quickened. It would take only one nervous hand, one frightened man, to turn a misunderstanding into bloodshed. She saddled her horse, tightening the strap with shaking hands. The sky was turning gray, the light weak but growing. The path to the river shimmered with dew, and every step of the horse's hooves sounded too loud in the stillness. She rode toward the crossing, her mind racing with half-formed plans. Maybe she could reach the tribe first, warn them again to stay hidden until the soldiers passed. Or maybe she could reach the deputy and convince him to turn back. Either way, she had to try before the first shot was fired as she neared the river. She saw movement in the trees, a familiar small figure standing on the far bank. The boy. He waved once, then pointed to the ridge, his face tense. She looked up and saw riders spreading out across the slope, their rifles slung and ready. The boy shouted something in his language, too distant for her to hear clearly, but she caught the fear in his voice. The sound of hooves echoed again, this time behind her. She turned sharply to see the deputy and 4 men from the settlement galloping down the trail. Their faces were set with grim determination, their guns resting across their saddles. "Stay back," the deputy called when he saw her. "It's not safe here. The Comanche are camped across the ridge. They're not attacking," she shouted back, urging her horse forward to block the path. "You'll start a fight if you go up there." The deputy's horse reared slightly as he pulled to a stop, his jaw tightening. "You don't understand. They raided a ranch last night, took cattle. The trader saw their tracks himself." She shook her head fiercely. "Those tracks are old. You'll bring death for nothing," the men behind him muttered, uneasy. But none lowered their weapons. The deputy glanced toward the ridge, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. Before he could answer, a single rifle shot cracked through the air. The sound rolled across the plains like thunder. Birds scattered from the trees, and for a moment, time itself seemed to stop. Then chaos erupted. The deputy shouted for his men to hold, but it was too late. One of the riders fired toward the ridge, and smoke rose from the far side, where the Comanche had hidden. Arrows flashed through the air, striking the dirt near the patrol's horses. The animals panicked, kicking and turning. She screamed for them to stop, but the wind carried her voice away. Her horse bolted toward the river, the reins slipping from her hands. She fought to steady him, pulling hard until they reached the shallow bend where the quicksand lay. The boy was waving frantically from the opposite bank, shouting something over and over. She realized he was warning her. Behind her, the deputy's men were retreating, firing into the trees, while others on the ridge were answering with arrows. The sound was deafening gunfire, hooves, shouting, and the cries of frightened animals. She dismounted, knowing she couldn't stay on the open path. She crouched by the riverbank, the mud cold under her palms, and tried to think. Somewhere beyond the trees, the tribe's women and children would be hiding. Somewhere nearby, the chief was watching this all unfold. She had to reach him before it turned worse. She cupped her hands and shouted across the water, calling the boy's name. He pointed toward a low trail that led up the ridge, a hidden way between the trees. She nodded and began to run. The climb was steep and the ground slippery with dew. Her skirt tore on a thorn bush, but she didn't stop. The closer she got, the louder the noise grew. She could smell gunpowder now, mixed with the heavy scent of smoke and wet grass. When she reached the crest, she saw the chief standing among his men, their bows drawn but aimed low. His face was carved from stone, eyes fixed on the distant patrol, regrouping below. The boy and his sister were beside him, their expressions. She stumbled into the clearing, gasping for breath. The warriors turned toward her instantly, some raising weapons in alarm. But the chief lifted his hand, signaling them to hold. She stepped forward, her voice breaking. "They think you attacked the ranch. They're coming because they're afraid. You have to stop your men before someone dies." The chief looked past her at the smoke rising from the trees, then back at her face. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he spoke softly in his language, his tone steady but heavy. The sister translated quietly. "He says they do not wish to fight, but their camp is surrounded. If they move, they are hunted. If they stay, they burn. She looked back down at the valley where the deputy and his men were regrouping near the water. She could see the traitor among them, pointing toward the ridge and shouting. She knew his type, the kind who profited from fear. The chief's warriors were growing restless. She could feel the tension in the air. Like the seconds before lightning strikes. The boy tugged her sleeve and pointed to the quicksand crossing below. 2 riders were trying to move their horses through it, unaware of the danger. The mud was already pulling at their hooves. If they sank, panic would follow, and the shooting would start again. Without thinking, she grabbed the chief's arm and pointed. "If they die, there will be no peace left," she said. The chief stared at her, then at the trapped riders. His jaw tightened, and he gave a short command. The boy ran down the path, his small figure darting between rocks and trees. She followed him, sliding down the slope until they reached the river again. One of the horses was screaming, sinking fast into the soft ground. The rider struggled to dismount, but his boot was stuck in the stirrup. The other tried to help, pulling on the reins, but it only made things worse. "Don't move," she shouted, running toward them. "You'll sink faster." The deputy heard her voice and turned. "Get back. It's dangerous," he yelled, but she ignored him. The boy threw a rope toward her, and she caught it, looping it around a nearby tree. Together, they tossed the other end toward the trapped rider. The man grabbed it with shaking hands, his face pale with terror. She pulled, her muscles straining, while the boy braced the rope against the ground. Slowly, inch by inch, the man came free, falling hard onto solid ground. The horse broke loose, thrashing wildly before collapsing. The second rider barely managed to pull his mount away. For a moment, no one moved. The gunfire had stopped. The deputy stared across the river, seeing her and the boy standing side by side, covered in mud, but alive. The chief and his warriors had stepped from the trees, weapons lowered, watching in silence. The wind carried a stillness so deep it felt sacred. Then the traitor shouted from behind the deputy, "It's a trick. They're setting you up." He raised his rifle, aiming toward the ridge. The deputy spun, grabbing the barrel just as it fired, the shot going wild into the air. The sound shattered the fragile peace. The boy flinched, and the chief's men tensed, ready to defend. She ran forward, her voice desperate. "Stop! Enough!" But no one could hear her over the echo of the gunshot rolling through the valley. The air crackled with danger again, every heartbeat carrying the weight of what might come next. The deputy's men turned uncertainly, torn between orders and fear. The tribe's warriors raised their bows, their faces hard with resolve. She stood in the middle of the river, cold water rushing around her boots, her hands raised as if to hold the world still. The boy was beside her, clutching the rope, his eyes wide but fearless. On one side stood the settlers, frightened and armed. On the other, the tribe, proud and cornered. The next breath would decide everything the peace she had tried to protect. The kindness that had begun with one rescue at the river, the fragile thread holding 2 worlds apart. The thunder rolled again above them, but this time it was real. Dark clouds gathered fast over the plains, wind sweeping across the tall grass. Rain began to fall, slow at first, then heavier, washing over them all. The river rose with it, wild and cold. She looked from the deputy to the chief, her voice trembling. "If you fight now, no one walks away from this valley." The wind howled, carrying her words between them. For a heartbeat, neither side moved. The storm raged louder, drowning out every sound but the pulse of the river and the promise of something. It's about to break one. The last fragile moment before the world chose between ruin and redemption. The rain poured harder, soaking the ground until the river swelled and the quicksand disappeared beneath the rising water. The lightning flashed above the valley, and for a long moment no one dared move. The woman stood in the middle of the river, her hands raised, her hair plastered against her face, her voice trembling through the storm. "No more fighting," she called, her tone filled with something deeper than fear, pleading, human, true. "You've all seen enough death. Let this end before it begins." Her words cut through the storm like a fragile thread, yet something in them held weight. The deputy, soaked and muddy, turned to look at her. His men were exhausted, their faces pale with confusion. The traitor still clutched his rifle, but his arrogance had started to crack. Across the river, the chief and his warriors stood firm, their bows drawn but motionless. Even the boy beside her seemed to hold his breath, watching both sides like the whole world depended on what happened next. The rain blurred everything: the land, the sky, the difference between right and wrong. The deputy slowly lowered his weapon. His voice came out hoarse but steady. "Call them off," he said to the traitor. "We're done here." The traitor's eyes flared with disbelief. "You're letting them go? After what they did?" "They didn't do anything," the deputy said sharply, his tone low but commanding. "You heard her. You saw her pull my men out of that river while your shot nearly started a war?" The traitor's jaw clenched, his hand twitching near the trigger. But the others were watching him, now his men, the deputy, even the Comanche chief across the river. The moment stretched thin. Then the traitor swore under his breath and threw the rifle into the mud. "You'll regret this," he muttered, before turning his horse back toward the road. The other riders followed slowly, heads bowed. The woman exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. The deputy dismounted and approached her carefully, his boots sinking into the soaked earth. "You saved us all," he said quietly, wiping the rain from his eyes. She shook her head, glancing toward the ridge where the chief still stood. "I only did what anyone should," she said. The deputy nodded once, then looked to the chief. He hesitated, then raised his hand in a gesture of truce. The chief studied him for a long moment before returning the gesture, solemn and sure. No words were needed. The storm itself seemed to soften around them, thunder rolling farther away. When the rain finally eased, the valley lay still. The river had calmed, carrying away the last traces of mud and smoke. The Comanche warriors melted back into the trees, silent as the dawn mist, but the chief lingered. He crossed the shallow bend, the water rippling around his boots, and stopped before her. The boy and his sister stood beside him, their faces lit by the pale light breaking through the clouds. The chief spoke in his language, his voice deep and measured. The sister translated softly. "He says the land remembers kindness. He says the river that took his son's breath now gives it back to all who stand here. He says peace will live if people like you stand between the fires." She felt tears rise unbidden, mixing with the rain still clinging to her face. "Tell him it wasn't courage," she said. "It was just what was right." The chief nodded as if he understood every word. He placed his hand over his heart, then extended it toward her. In his palm lay the same carved eagle she had seen before in the bundle of gifts, its wings wide, its eyes bright from the polish of care. "He says this belongs to the bridge between his people and yours," the sister whispered. She took it, her fingers trembling. The chief turned then, mounted his horse, and with one final nod, rode away toward the distant hills. The boy lingered a moment longer, smiling shyly before following after him, his small figure fading into the mist. The deputy stood beside her, quiet. The sound of the river filled the silence between them. Finally he said, "I reckon the fort will want a report. But I'll tell them it was a misunderstanding. You have my word." She gave a faint smile. "That's all it ever was," she replied. Days passed, and the land began to heal. The grass rose green again where the storm had flattened it. Birds returned to the trees, and the river settled into its gentle rhythm. Word spread through the settlement about the standoff by the river, but no one seemed eager to stir the story into more than a whisper. The trader packed up his wagon and left for good, heading east. The deputy stopped by once before riding back to the fort. He brought supplies and left without many words, but the look in his eyes carried something close to respect. The woman's cabin became quiet again, but it was no longer the same kind of quiet as before. Sometimes at dawn, she saw riders far in the distance near the ridge shadows that disappeared when the light touched them. Other mornings, she found fresh herbs or wildflowers left by the riverbank. She never saw who left them, but she always knew. One evening, as the sun dipped low and turned the sky to amber, she walked down to the river's edge. The quicksand had dried again, cracked and pale under the fading light. She stood there a long time, tracing her fingers over the carved eagle hanging from her neck. The memory of that first morning when she had seen the boy sinking came back to her. The fear, the instinct to save him without question. It had been the beginning of something she never expected, something that showed her that kindness, even in a wild land divided by fear, could still change everything. The boy had once told her that the river had a spirit, that it remembered those who crossed it with good hearts. She looked down at its shimmering surface and believed him. Somewhere beyond those hills, his people were watching the same sunset, and for the first time in years, the plains felt peaceful as darkness crept in. She lit a single lantern and set it on the porch. Its glow flickered softly, a signal not of warning, but of welcome. The night air carried the sound of crickets, and the wind rustled through the cottonwoods like a whisper of thanks in time. The story of that day became part of the valley's quiet legend. Travelers who passed through spoke of the woman who had stood between two worlds, who stopped a war with nothing more than her courage and her voice. Some said the Comanche still watched over her land, keeping it safe. Others swore that when the river rose high in spring, the water carved shapes in the mud that looked like feathers. Years later, when settlers built new homes along the river, they often wondered why the land there seemed so calm even during harsh seasons. The older ones would tell them it was because peace had once been forged here not by treaty or force, but by mercy. They would tell of a woman who reached into the quicksand to save a child and ended up saving an entire valley. One spring morning, long after the storms had faded, she found a bundle at her doorstep. Inside was a necklace of colored beads and a small carved stone. A familiar eagle symbol was etched into it, but newer, freshly made. Alongside it was a feather tied with red thread and a sprig of wild sage. There was no note, but she didn't need one. The gift spoke in the old way, quiet but powerful. She smiled, touched the carving, and whispered a prayer of gratitude to the open sky. The wind moved gently through the grass, bending it in waves like water. The river flowed steady and sure, carrying the reflection of the bright morning sun. Life had gone on, but it carried with it the memory of what had been saved, the hope that kindness could bridge fear, that courage could outlast hate. She sat on her porch that afternoon, watching the horizon where the ridge met the clouds. For the first time in a long while, she felt peace, not as something fragile, but as something earned. The land was quiet but not lonely. The same spirit that had guided her hand that morning by the river seemed to linger still, woven into the sound of water and wind. And when night came and the stars stretched across the sky, she lit her lantern again, not because she feared the dark, but because light, once given, should always remain. The glow shimmered across the valley, reflecting on the river's surface where once a life had been saved, and now peace too was alive.